In the year 33 AD, a Roman governor in Jerusalem dipped his hands into a basin of water, looked out at a crowd screaming for blood, and said 5 words that would follow him into eternity. "I am innocent of this man's blood." His name was Pontius Pilate, and he had just condemned the most important figure in human history to die on a wooden cross. Now, you probably know that part of the story. It is told in churches around the world every single year. But what you probably do not know is what happened to Pilate after that moment. Because the Gospels go quiet. The cameras, so to speak, stop rolling on Pilate the second Jesus is led away to Golgotha. However, history did not stop recording. And what the ancient sources describe, what the early church fathers wrote, what the legends across Europe and the Middle East preserved for 2,000 years, is one of the most disturbing downfalls of any figure in the ancient world. We are talking exile. We are talking madness. We are talking about a man so haunted by what he had done that multiple ancient traditions agree on the same ending. Pontius Pilate, the 5th prefect of the Roman province of Judea, took his own life. But how did it get to that point? What happened between the hand-washing and the grave? And why did some early Christians actually believe Pilate repented and became a secret follower of the very man he sentenced to death? This is the story that the Bible does not finish telling, and it changes everything you thought you knew about that day in Jerusalem. 7 years before that morning outside the Praetorium, Pontius Pilate was nobody. A mid-ranking Roman officer sitting in a government building somewhere in Italy, filling out paperwork, waiting for his name to be called for an assignment that would probably never come. He was not an emperor on a golden throne. He was not even close. Pontius Pilate was a mid-level Roman bureaucrat, a political climber, the kind of man who spent his career trying to get noticed by the right people in Rome, making the right connections, saying the right things at the right banquets, and for a while it worked. His family name, Pontius, suggests he may have come from the Samnite region of central Italy, not Roman aristocracy, not even close. The Pontii were provincial elites at best, people who had clawed their way into the lower ranks of the Roman equestrian order through military service and political loyalty. Pilate was not born into power. He was born adjacent to it, and everything about his career suggests a man desperately trying to close that gap. Around 26 AD, Pilate received his appointment as the prefect of Judea. Now, on the surface, that sounds impressive. A Roman prefect, governor of an entire province. But anyone in Rome who knew anything about politics understood that Judea was not a promotion. Judea was a punishment. The province was a political nightmare, a remote, dusty stretch of the Eastern Empire filled with people who did not want to be ruled by Rome. The Jewish population had their own laws, their own temple, their own god, and they were not interested in bowing to Caesar. Religious tensions were constant. Revolts were always simmering just beneath the surface, and every Roman governor who had served there before Pilate had left either disgraced, recalled, or dead. So why did Pilate take the job? Because he probably did not have a choice. And if you read between the lines of the ancient sources, there are hints that Pilate did not want it. Judea had a reputation in Rome. Senators joked about it. It was the posting you gave to someone you wanted to get rid of, not someone you wanted to reward. Pilate would have known that. He would have seen what happened to the governors before him. And yet he went. Because in Roman politics, refusing an assignment from your patron was worse than failing at it. That reluctance matters, because it means Pilate walked into Judea already resentful, already defensive, already looking for a way to prove himself so he could get out. And a resentful governor in a hostile province is a dangerous combination. Historians have traced Pilate's appointment to a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius, and for a period in the late 20s AD, he was essentially the second most powerful man in the Roman Empire. Sejanus was also, according to ancient sources, fiercely hostile toward Jewish communities. This matters, because if Pilate got his position through Sejanus, then his entire career was built on one man's patronage. And in Roman politics, when your patron fell, you fell with him. Pilate arrived in Judea and immediately started making enemies. One of the first things he did was order Roman military standards bearing the image of Emperor Tiberius to be brought into Jerusalem. Now, to a Roman, this was standard procedure. You put up the emperor's image. You show who is in charge. But to the Jewish population, this was an outrage. Their law forbade graven images, especially in the Holy City. Thousands of Jews marched to Pilate's headquarters in Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast and protested for 5 straight days. Pilate's response was telling. He surrounded the protesters with soldiers and threatened to kill them all. The Jewish demonstrators called his bluff. They laid down on the ground and bared their necks, saying they would rather die than see their laws violated. Pilate backed down. He removed the standards. And this is crucial to understanding the man, because it reveals something about Pilate that would define every major decision he ever made. He was not a man of conviction. He was a man of calculation. He would push as far as he thought he could get away with, and the moment the pressure became too great, he would fold. He did it again with the aqueduct incident. Pilate used money from the sacred temple treasury to fund the construction of an aqueduct into Jerusalem. When protesters gathered, this time Pilate sent soldiers disguised as civilians into the crowd with clubs hidden under their cloaks. On his signal, they attacked. People were beaten, some were killed. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus recorded the incident with barely concealed disgust. But even after the violence, the pattern held. Pilate accomplished the project, but the political cost was enormous. Jerusalem's religious leaders hated him, the people distrusted him, and back in Rome, his patron Sejanus was about to have problems of his own. This next part is what turns Pilate's story from a mediocre political career into a tragedy. In 31 AD, Emperor Tiberius discovered that Sejanus had been plotting against him. Sejanus was arrested, executed, and his entire network of allies was purged. Anyone connected to Sejanus was suddenly a target. Pontius Pilate was now a man without a safety net, a governor in a hostile province, hated by the local population, with no political protector back in Rome. Every decision he made from this point forward carried the weight of a man who knew that one wrong move could end everything. And then, in the spring of approximately 33 AD, the high priest of the Jerusalem temple and the members of the Sanhedrin brought a prisoner to his doorstep, a Galilean preacher named Jesus of Nazareth, and they wanted him dead. The morning of the trial was not a normal morning in Jerusalem. The city was swollen with pilgrims. It was Passover, the holiest time of the Jewish calendar, when hundreds of thousands of Jews flooded into the city to commemorate their liberation from Egypt. The Roman garrison was on high alert. Every Passover was a potential powder keg, and Pilate had traveled from his coastal residence in Caesarea to Jerusalem specifically to keep order. So when the Jewish religious authorities dragged a bound prisoner to the praetorium before sunrise, Pilate already had a problem. This was political. Everything in Jerusalem was political, and the timing was deliberate. The Sanhedrin brought Jesus to Pilate at dawn, before the city had fully woken up, before any potential supporters of the Galilean preacher could mobilize. This was a coordinated political operation designed to back Pilate into a corner with no way out. Here is the prisoner. Here are the charges. Here is the crowd we have assembled. Now judge. The charges the Sanhedrin brought against Jesus were carefully crafted. They did not lead with blasphemy, which was a religious offense under Jewish law. Rome did not care about Jewish theology. Instead, they framed Jesus as a political threat. They said he was claiming to be the king of the Jews. They said he was telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar. They said he was stirring up rebellion from Galilee to Jerusalem. These were charges that Pilate could not ignore, because if a man was claiming to be a king in a Roman province, and the governor did nothing about it, that governor was guilty of tolerating sedition. And for a man whose political patron had just been executed for treason, ignoring a charge of sedition was career suicide. But when Pilate interrogated Jesus privately inside the praetorium, something unexpected happened. The Gospel of John records the exchange in remarkable detail. Pilate asked Jesus directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus responded with a question of his own. "Are you asking this on your own, Or did others tell you about me?" This was not the response of a revolutionary. Pilate could see that. The man standing before him was not organizing an army. He was not hoarding weapons. He was a teacher, a rabbi, someone who spoke about a kingdom that, as he put it, is not of this world. Pilate walked back outside and told the crowd plainly, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." And that should have been the end of it. But the crowd erupted. The religious leaders pressed harder. They invoked Caesar's name. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." That line was a threat, and Pilate felt every syllable of it. Think about what was happening in this moment. Pilate knew, based on his own interrogation, that Jesus was not guilty of the charges against him. The Gospel accounts are remarkably consistent on this point. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record Pilate attempting to release Jesus. He tried sending him to Herod Antipas, the Jewish tetrarch of Galilee, hoping someone else would handle the problem. Herod sent Jesus back. Pilate offered the crowd a choice between Jesus and a convicted criminal named Barabbas, fully expecting them to choose the release of the innocent man. They chose Barabbas. And then there was the dream. The Gospel of Matthew records a detail that rarely gets attention today, but that ancient Christian writers considered one of the most significant moments of the entire trial. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife, Claudia Procula, sent him an urgent message. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." In the ancient world, dreams were not casual. Romans took prophetic dreams very seriously. A warning dream from a senator's wife during a capital trial would have sent chills down any Roman magistrate's spine. The Roman historian Suetonius records that Caesar's wife Calpurnia dreamed of his murder the night before the Ides of March. Augustus made policy decisions based on dreams. For a Roman official, ignoring a warning dream was not just personal recklessness, it was tempting fate. Early church tradition held that Claudia's dream was sent by God himself as a final warning, a last chance for Pilate to choose differently. Some early church fathers, including Origen in the 3rd century, believed that Claudia herself was a God-fearer, a Roman woman sympathetic to Jewish monotheism, and that her dream was a genuine act of divine intervention. The fact that Matthew records this detail at all suggests that the early Christian community considered it theologically significant. God had spoken. Pilate had been warned. What he did next was entirely his choice. He did not take it. Instead, Pilate did what Pilate always did. He calculated. He weighed the political cost of releasing Jesus against the political cost of condemning him. And the math was simple. Releasing Jesus meant a riot. A riot meant a report to Rome. A report to Rome, with Sejanus's shadow still hanging over his name, meant the end of his career and possibly his life. So Pilate called for a basin of water. The act of washing his hands was not random. In Jewish tradition, outlined in the book of Deuteronomy, the elders of a city would wash their hands over a heifer to declare their innocence when a murder occurred and the killer was unknown. Pilate was appropriating a Jewish ritual to make a point to a Jewish crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." But there is a detail about that gesture that changes everything once you see it. It did not work. Not legally, not morally, and certainly not psychologically. Under Roman law, Pilate was the sole authority in that courtyard. He had the power to release Jesus with a single word. The crowd had no legal standing. The Sanhedrin had no execution authority under Roman occupation. Pilate was not sharing the decision. He was making it, and he was pretending he was not. This is the moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, because deep down, in the part of his mind where the dream warning still echoed and the face of the innocent man still lingered, Pontius Pilate knew exactly what he had done. He had killed an innocent man to save his own career. After the crucifixion, the Gospels shift their focus to the resurrection, to the apostles, to the birth of the early church. Pilate disappears from the narrative like a character who has served his purpose in the story. But Pilate did not disappear from history. The years immediately following the crucifixion were a slow-motion disaster for Pontius Pilate. His authority in Judea continued to erode. His relationship with the Jewish population was beyond repair, and the political ground beneath him was getting thinner by the month. Then, in approximately 35 or 36 AD, Pilate made the mistake that finally ended him. A Samaritan prophet, whose name has been lost to history, gathered a large crowd of followers on Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim was the most sacred site for the Samaritan people, their equivalent of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This prophet promised his followers that he would show them sacred vessels that Moses himself had buried on the mountain centuries earlier. Now, there is no evidence that this gathering was violent. The Samaritans were not organizing a rebellion, they were making a religious pilgrimage. But Pilate saw a large gathering of people moving toward a mountain, and his instinct, the same instinct that had led him to club protesters and smuggle military standards, took over. He sent Roman infantry and cavalry to block the road leading up Mount Gerizim. When the crowd arrived, Pilate's soldiers attacked. The ancient sources describe a slaughter. Many Samaritans were killed in the assault. Others were captured. Pilate then ordered the leaders of the group executed. The Samaritan community was outraged, and unlike previous incidents where Pilate's victims had no one to appeal to, the Samaritans took their case directly to Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria. Vitellius was Pilate's superior, the highest-ranking Roman official in the eastern provinces. Vitellius investigated the complaint and determined that Pilate had overreacted catastrophically. His order was immediate and devastating. Pontius Pilate was stripped of his office and ordered to return to Rome to explain himself before Emperor Tiberius. After roughly 10 years as prefect of Judea, Pilate's career was over. He left the province in disgrace, sailing westward across the Mediterranean toward a reckoning that would never arrive the way he expected. Because while Pilate was still making his long journey back to Rome, Emperor Tiberius died. Tiberius passed away in March of 37 AD at his villa on the island of Capri. The emperor who had appointed Pilate, the emperor before whom Pilate was supposed to defend himself, was gone. And in his place sat a new emperor whose very name would become synonymous with madness. The world knew him as Caligula. Pilate arrived in Rome to find a completely different political landscape. Caligula was unpredictable, violent, and prone to executing officials on a whim. There was no friendly audience waiting for Pilate. There was no chance to explain his side of the story to a sympathetic Tiberius. There was only the cold reality that he was a disgraced former governor in a city that devoured disgraced men. And this is where the ancient scrolls and manuscripts of Rome go silent on Pilate's fate. This is where Flavius Josephus, the most reliable Roman-era Jewish historian, stops mentioning Pilate entirely. Josephus records Pilate's removal from office and his journey to Rome, but then, nothing. Silence, as if Pilate simply ceased to exist. But other sources picked up the thread, and what they describe is a descent into darkness that reads more like a psychological horror story than a historical account. The early church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century, provides the most widely cited account of Pilate's end. In his monumental work, The Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius states that Pontius Pilate fell into such great misfortune during the reign of Caligula that he was forced to become his own executioner. Eusebius writes that Pilate killed himself, and he adds that divine justice, it would seem, did not delay his punishment for long. That single passage has echoed through 20 centuries of Christian tradition. The man who condemned Jesus to death could not escape his own conscience. He became, in the words of Eusebius, his own executioner. But what drove him to it? What happened in those final years between his arrival in Rome and his death? This is where the parchment records of Eusebius and the medieval manuscripts tell very different stories, and we need to carefully separate them. Let us start with what we can reasonably piece together from the historical evidence. When Pilate arrived in Rome, he was a man without allies, without office, and without purpose. The Roman political system had no safety net, for failed governors. You were either useful to the emperor or you were invisible. And under Caligula, being invisible was actually the best-case scenario, because being noticed by Caligula often meant being dead. Ancient tradition holds that Pilate was exiled, not formally executed, not thrown into a dungeon, but sent away from Rome to live out his remaining years in obscurity. The most persistent tradition places his exile in Gaul, in a region near the city of Vienne, in what is now southeastern France. Eusebius and later medieval chroniclers mention Vienne specifically. Other sources across the centuries support this location. Imagine the contrast. A man who once held the power of life and death over an entire province, who commanded Roman legions and sat on a judgment seat that decided the fate of nations, now living in a provincial town on the edges of the empire, without authority, without relevance, without purpose. Just the long, empty days and the memory of what he had done. And in Gaul, Pilate would have been surrounded by reminders of everything he had lost. The Roman cities of Gaul were miniature versions of Rome itself, with forums and temples and magistrates who held the kind of authority Pilate had once wielded. He would have walked through the streets of Vienne as a ghost of the man he used to be, recognized by no one, feared by no one, needed by no one. The ancient Greek philosopher Plutarch once wrote that the punishment of the wicked lies not in the suffering that comes after sin, but in the sin itself, that the guilty carry their own prison wherever they go. If that is true, then Pilate's exile in Gaul was not his punishment. His punishment had begun the moment he lifted his wet hands from that basin of water in Jerusalem. But what the ancient Christian texts describe next makes everything we have covered so far feel like a prologue. The traditions do not describe Pilate finding peace in exile. They describe the opposite. Multiple ancient Christian texts, some dating back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, depict Pilate as a man tormented by guilt. The so-called Acts of Pilate, also known as the Gospel of Nicodemus, is one of the most important of these texts. While not a canonical scripture, it was widely read and deeply influential in the early church. The Acts of Pilate presents an extended account of the trial of Jesus from Pilate's perspective, and it paints a picture of a man who recognized the innocence of Jesus, who tried to prevent the execution, and who was ultimately overwhelmed by political pressure. The text suggests that Pilate was haunted not by ignorance but by knowledge. He knew what he was doing when he handed Jesus over, and that knowledge, according to the tradition, became a kind of poison that ate away at his mind for years. Other early Christian writings describe Pilate experiencing visions, nightmares, the face of the man he condemned appearing to him in the darkness. His wife, Claudia, who had warned him through her dream, reportedly became a Christian herself. Some traditions hold that she left him. Others say she stayed and watched him deteriorate. Either way, the picture that emerges is of a household shattered by a single decision. And then there is the Swiss legend. One of the most haunting traditions about Pilate comes not from the Middle East or Rome, but from the heart of the Alps. Mount Pilatus, a jagged peak rising nearly 7,000 feet above the city of Lucerne in Switzerland, is named, according to medieval legend, after Pontius Pilate himself. The legend says that after his death, Pilate's body was thrown into the Tiber River in Rome, but the waters rejected it. Violent storms erupted wherever the body was placed. The Romans tried dumping the corpse in the Rhone River in France. Same result. Storms, flooding, destruction. Finally, they carried the body to a remote lake high in the Swiss Alps and sank it there. For centuries, the people of Lucerne believed that Pilate's restless spirit inhabited the mountain. On stormy nights, they said you could see his ghost sitting on the peak, endlessly washing his hands in the dark water, trying to cleanse the blood that would never come off. The local government actually passed laws at one point forbidding people from climbing the mountain, out of fear that disturbing Pilate's spirit would bring calamity to the region. These laws remained in effect well into the 16th century. Think about that. A mountain in the Swiss Alps, closed by law, because of a dead Roman governor, for 1,500 years. If that does not tell you how deeply this story embedded itself in the European imagination, nothing will. There are similar legends in other parts of Europe. A lake near the town of Vienne in France was also said to be haunted by Pilate's spirit. In some Italian traditions, Pilate's body was thrown into a volcanic lake, and the eruptions were attributed to his restless torment. The medieval imagination could not let Pilate rest, and maybe that says something deeper about the human understanding of guilt. We intuitively know that some decisions cannot be simply buried and forgotten. They demand to be reckoned with. Is this historically accurate? Of course not. It is a legend. But legends do not come from nowhere. They grow from a seed of cultural memory. And the seed at the center of every Pilate legend across every culture is the same. This was a man who could not outrun his guilt. If you are finding this deep dive into Pilate's story as gripping as I found it while researching, hit subscribe. We uncover the hidden stories behind the Bible's most mysterious figures every single week. Because what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church did with Pilate's legacy is something almost nobody in the Western world knows about. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that might genuinely surprise you. Because not everyone in the ancient world saw Pilate as a villain. Some of the earliest Christian communities saw him as something far more complicated, and in a few traditions, as something much closer to a saint. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church canonized Pontius Pilate. That is not a typo. In the Ethiopian Christian tradition, Pilate is considered a saint. His feast day is celebrated on June 25th. The Coptic Church of Egypt has a similar tradition, and they also honor Claudia Procula, his wife, as a saint. How is that possible? How do you go from the man who sent Jesus to the cross to a canonized saint? The answer lies in how these traditions read the gospel accounts. When they look at the trial narrative, they do not see a coward. They see a man who tried. They see a Roman pagan who interrogated Jesus, found him innocent, publicly declared that innocence multiple times, attempted to release him, offered the crowd alternatives, and only relented when the political pressure became unbearable. In the Gospel of John, Pilate goes back and forth between Jesus and the crowd no fewer than 7 times. 7. He keeps walking inside the praetorium to talk to Jesus, then walking back outside to negotiate with the crowd. Each time, he tries a different strategy to release the prisoner. He invokes the Passover amnesty custom. He sends Jesus to Herod. He offers to have Jesus flogged as a compromise, hoping that visible suffering will satisfy the crowd's bloodlust without requiring execution. None of it works. But the Ethiopian and Coptic traditions focus on the fact that he tried it all. No other Roman governor in the historical record is described agonizing over the execution of a provincial subject. Roman justice was swift and brutal. Crucifixion was routine. The fact that Pilate hesitated, questioned, resisted, and sought alternatives was, in the eyes of these traditions, evidence of something working on his conscience. In this reading, Pilate's sin was not malice, it was weakness. And weakness, in the Christian theological tradition, is something that can be forgiven, especially if it is followed by repentance. The early Christian writer Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, actually described Pilate as a Christian in his conscience. Tertullian believed that Pilate's heart was convinced of Jesus' innocence, and that his report to Emperor Tiberius about the crucifixion was sympathetic to the Christian cause. There is even a tradition, preserved in some early sources, that Pilate wrote a letter to Tiberius describing the miracles and character of Jesus and expressing regret for what had happened. Historians debate the authenticity of this letter. Most consider it a later fabrication, but its existence reveals something important about how the early church grappled with Pilate's role. They could not simply dismiss him as a monster. The gospel accounts made that impossible. The Gospels show a conflicted man, not a bloodthirsty tyrant, and early Christians, many of whom lived under Roman persecution themselves, understood what it meant to be caught between conscience and survival. But the debate inside the ancient church councils and monasteries took a surprising turn. Even in the traditions that show Pilate's sympathy, even in the Ethiopian church that calls him a saint, the core message remains the same. Pilate had a choice. He had the power to do the right thing. He had the authority, the information, and even a supernatural warning through his wife's dream. And he chose to protect himself instead. That is the knife's edge of the entire story. Not that Pilate was uniquely evil, but that Pilate was uniquely positioned to choose differently and did not. And when you understand that, the legends of his madness and suicide stop feeling like mythological exaggeration. They start feeling like the inevitable psychological consequence of a man who betrayed his own conscience at the most critical moment of his life. The question of exactly how Pilate died remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient history. But the traditions converge on a remarkably consistent picture, even when they disagree on the details. Eusebius says suicide. He does not specify the method, but his language is deliberate. He calls Pilate his own executioner. That phrasing implies a level of intentionality and self-judgment that goes beyond simple despair. It is as if Pilate pronounced a sentence on himself, the way he had once pronounced sentence on others. The Greek original of Eusebius's text uses a word that suggests Pilate drove a weapon into his own body. Whether that means a sword or a dagger, we cannot know. But the image is vivid. The same hand that signed the execution order for Jesus of Nazareth ultimately turned that judgment inward. Some historians have noted the parallel to other Roman suicides. In Roman culture, suicide was not always seen as shameful. For a disgraced military or political figure, falling on your own sword was considered an honorable exit. Brutus did it after the Battle of Philippi. Mark Antony did it after his defeat at Actium. Nero was told to do it by the Senate. If Pilate did take his own life, he was following a well-established Roman tradition for men who had lost everything. But Eusebius does not frame Pilate's death as honorable. He frames it as divine retribution. That is a crucial difference. In Eusebius's telling, Pilate did not die like a Roman. He died like a man being consumed by the consequences of his own actions. Some later traditions claim Pilate was executed by order of Caligula or his successor Nero, but the historical timeline makes Nero unlikely, and there is no strong evidence for a formal execution under Caligula. The suicide tradition remains the most widely accepted. The Mors Pilati, a medieval text meaning the death of Pilate, provides the most dramatic account. In this version, Pilate was summoned before the emperor but was wearing a seamless garment that had once belonged to Jesus. As long as he wore it, the emperor could not bring himself to condemn Pilate. But once the garment was removed, Pilate was sentenced to death and, depending on the version, either killed himself or was executed. Again, this is legend, not history, but it carries a theological message that resonated powerfully in the medieval Christian world. Even the garment of Christ could not protect a man who had betrayed him. Borrowed holiness does not save you, only genuine repentance does. The Paradosis of Pilate, another early text, describes Pilate praying to God before his death, asking for forgiveness and claiming that it was the lawless Jews who forced his hand. A voice from heaven reportedly answered him, declaring that all generations would call him blessed because the prophecies concerning Christ had to be fulfilled during his governance. In this tradition, Pilate was both guilty and forgiven, a tragic instrument of divine prophecy who suffered terribly for the role he played. And then there is the most psychologically devastating detail preserved in the ancient sources. Multiple traditions describe Pilate in his final days as being unable to stop washing his hands, over and over, compulsively, obsessively, as if the gesture he performed once in a Jerusalem courtyard became a ritual he could never complete. The stain, whatever it was, would not come off. If that sounds familiar, it should. Shakespeare wrote a similar scene for Lady Macbeth centuries later. Out, damned spot. Out, I say. But Pilate's hand-washing predates Shakespeare by more than 1,000 years. And unlike Lady Macbeth, this was not a fictional character created for dramatic effect. This was a real historical figure whose psychological torment became so legendary that it shaped literature, theology, and folklore across 3 continents. So, what does any of this mean for you, watching this right now? Here is what struck me most about researching this story. Pilate's tragedy was not that he made a wrong decision. His tragedy was that he knew it was wrong and made it anyway. He had every piece of information he needed. He had an innocent man standing in front of him. He had his own interrogation confirming that innocence. He had a supernatural warning from his wife. He had the legal authority to stop it with one word. And he chose to wash his hands. Think about how many times in your own life you have stood at a crossroads where you knew the right thing to do, but the cost felt too high. Maybe it was standing up for someone at work when staying quiet was safer. Maybe it was telling the truth when a lie would have been easier. Maybe it was walking away from something profitable because your gut told you it was wrong. Maybe it was simply speaking up when everyone else in the room was staying silent. We all have our own version of the basin and the water. We all have moments where we try to wash our hands of responsibility, where we tell ourselves that the decision was not really ours, that the circumstances forced our hand, that anyone in our position would have done the same thing. But at 2 in the morning, when the house is quiet and you are lying in the dark staring at the ceiling, you know the truth. You had a choice, and you made it. That is what makes Pilate's story so uncomfortable. It is not about an ancient Roman governor in a distant century. It is about the version of Pilate that lives inside every human being. The voice that says, if I do the right thing, I might lose something. And the other voice, quieter but persistent, that says, if you do not, you will lose something worse. Pilate's story is not just ancient history. It is the story of every person who has ever traded their integrity for temporary safety. And the ancient sources are unanimous on what happened next. The safety was not permanent. The career he tried to protect crumbled anyway. The emperor he feared never gave him the audience he needed. The political system he served forgot about him completely. All he was left with was the memory of what he had done. And that memory, according to every tradition we have, consumed him. There is a reason that Pontius Pilate's name appears in the Apostles' Creed, one of the oldest statements of Christian faith. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. Every time a Christian recites those words, they are naming Pilate. Not Herod, not Caiaphas, not Judas. Pilate. Because Pilate represents something universal. He represents the moment when conscience speaks and you decide whether to listen. He represents the choice between what is right and what is convenient. He represents the terrifying reality that some decisions cannot be undone, and some water will never wash the stain away. The early church father Augustine of Hippo wrote that Pilate was caught between his fear of Caesar and his fear of the crowd, and in trying to serve both, he served neither and lost himself. That is perhaps the most concise summary of Pilate's entire life. A man who spent his career trying to navigate between competing powers, and in the end was crushed by all of them. Whether Pilate found redemption in his final moments, as the Ethiopian tradition suggests, or whether he died in despair, as Eusebius implies, is a question that no historian can answer. It belongs to the realm of faith. But what every source agrees on is that the decision he made on that spring morning in Jerusalem followed him for the rest of his life. It never let go. And maybe that is the real lesson of this story. Not that God punishes the guilty, but that the conscience has a memory that no amount of hand-washing can erase. Pilate's body, according to legend, was rejected by every river and every lake in Europe. The earth itself would not rest while his remains were present. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, the message is the same. You cannot bury what you refuse to face. You cannot wash away what you refuse to own. 2,000 years later, his name is still spoken every Sunday in churches around the world. The governor who thought he was making a forgettable political compromise ended up becoming the most remembered judge in human history. Not for what he ruled, but for what he refused to stop. If this story made you think about your own crossroads, the moments where you knew the right thing but felt the pressure to look away, then Pilate's tragedy was not wasted. It was a warning. And warnings only matter if someone hears them. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories where the Bible meets ancient history and reveals things you will never hear in a Sunday sermon, subscribe to this channel. We go deep into the mysteries of faith every single week. And if you want to know what happened to another figure who walked away from that crucifixion carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, the story of Judas Iscariot and the 30 pieces of silver, that video is on your screen right now. I will see you there.